Living near an ocean or a vast mountain range presents an opportunity to experience nature's beauty every day. However, nature can be fickle, turning great beauty into great devastation in what seems like the blink of an eye. When countries and cities face nature as a foe, there is little to do but survive the assault of the elements and rebuild in the wake of destruction. The Netherlands is a country renowned for its many forms of beauty. Tulips and windmills stretch as far as the eye can see. However, since the country's first days, it has fought a battle with the sea.
The land is lower than the sea, especially at high tide. The dike is a kind of a high road protecting the land itself against the sea. You must do something to protect it, otherwise it will flood it any 2 times a day.
In the 1950s, the Netherlands is primarily an agriculture-based economy, rebuilding its industrial capacity like most of the countries in Europe.
We just were recovering from the Second World War, so the whole issue was to rebuild the country.
The southwest corner of the country is especially fertile and contains many polders, or sections of land. It is an area heavily dependent on dams and dikes to keep water from flooding the farmland. However, the dikes protecting this area are not in the best state of repair.
De manier waarop de mensen over het water dachten.
The way people considered the water made them somewhat reckless. They paid too little attention to the maintenance of the dikes.
Het onderhoud van de dijken.
In 1953, Stoffel van Maurik lives with his parents on a farm outside the village of Capella. 3 other siblings also live at home: Stoffel's older brother Piet and younger sisters Katrien and Sarge.
Capella was een gemeenschap.
Capella was a small community of about 100.
100 mensen.
Most were working-class people, laborers, farmhands.
De arbeiders, boerenarbeiders.
Everybody knew everybody.
Elsewhere in the village, 13-year-old Nelleke van Dienst lives with her father, Jacob, and her mother, Lauch, and 3 siblings, a brother and 2 older sisters. Right across the street are Nelleke's maternal grandparents, Kees and Keitje Koopman.
My opa was 80 years old, and my oma 79. They lived in quite an old little house. I loved to go there. I used to go over once or twice a day for candy. I would also do some chores for them Saturday mornings.
In the winter months, severe storms often form over the North Sea. On Friday, January 30th, 1953, conditions are right for such a storm, creating a weather system that threatens England, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Overnight, the storm gains strength and wreaks havoc in the United Kingdom. On Saturday, January 31st, the storm continues southeast, bearing down on the coast of the Netherlands.
Saturday morning, around 9 o'clock, the first warnings were issued for considerable high tides for Saturday afternoon and the high tide on Sunday night.
1.5 kilometers from the sea, on a small flax farm near Ouwerkerk, 17-year-old Wim Kuiper watches the developing storm.
Saturday. During that day, the wind was cutting, fierce. The weather was rough and extremely cold. And already there was snow and hailstorms.
That evening, in spite of the weather, Wim and 3 friends go into town to play billiards. In nearby Capella, Stoffel van Maurik and Nelleke van Dienst travel separately to the same music concert.
Ik zat in mandolineorkest.
I was at a mandolin fest that Saturday evening. We went there with my brother and sister, my mother too.
Mijn moeder ook.
Some 20 kilometers north of Capella, in the village of Nieuwe Tonga, Jacob Hoenendijk takes advantage of his military leave to spend time with his girlfriend, Heisha.
There was a hurricane storm, and I couldn't go home, so I had to stay overnight.
As the hours pass, the storm continues to surge, and the Dutch Meteorological Service issues the most severe warning possible for dangerous high tides. Already close to being overwhelmed, the dikes barely contain the raging waters. Around midnight, Wim Kuiper returns home from a night out with his friends.
Wij gingen met z'n vieren om 12 uur naar huis.
The four of us went home at 12 o'clock. Once outside of the village, we were unable to buck the wind. We had to lock arms to walk home. There, we said goodbye.
We hebben er afscheid genomen.
In Capella, Stoffel van Maurik and Nelleke van Dienst return from attending the mandolin concert.
Dat is nog niet leuk, dat is nooit leuk geweest.
A raging storm is never any fun. But nothing ever happened, so we assumed that nothing would happen this time either.
Iets zou gebeuren, dus we gingen eigenlijk.
So we just went to sleep like always.
Slapen zoals we dat altijd deden.
En het gekke was, door al die storm, dat het...
Because of all that storm, the water level was the same, as high as it would be at high tide. That should have alerted people. That did alert a number of people. There was no emergency warning system, no disaster plan. The only way people were actually alerted was via the radio. That came by way of a weather warning. At least, it was a warning that one should count on a very high water. But that was only till 12 o'clock. At 11 o'clock was the last time it was broadcast on the radio.
The meteorologists here desperately tried to keep the radio in the air, but they failed.
Dutch radio signs off as scheduled at midnight. As the Netherlands sleeps, most are oblivious to the storm surge that is pushing the system of dikes beyond the breaking point. An unstoppable wall of water is about to be unleashed on the unsuspecting country. Saturday, January 31st, 1953. A ferocious storm over the North Sea is forcing water levels dangerously high at dikes all across the Netherlands. As the system of barriers against the water strains to the breaking point, the only mass warning system, Dutch radio, shuts down. It is now impossible to warn the country of the impending flood. In the wee hours of the morning, the North Sea suddenly rushes over the dikes in more than 100 places. Only 1.5 kilometers from the coast, water floods the home of Wim Kuiper and his family.
At 3:30, my father woke us up, and we stepped out of bed right into the water. It all happened so fast, and there is only one thing urgently clear. You've got to get out. We had to hurry like the devil to the village.
Battling the surging floodwaters, Wim and his family arrive at temporary safety. 10 kilometers south of the Kuipers, a wall of water bears down on the outskirts of Capella, threatening Stoffel van Maurik and his family.
At that moment, of course, you knew you had to act somehow. And we still wanted to get on our bikes to get away, but the water rose so fast. There was nowhere left to go. Our house, that was really quite an old house, we felt we could not rely on it.
With water rising everywhere, Stoffel and his family arrive at the home of relatives and help them prepare for the flood.
In dat huis, bij die oom.
We arrived at our uncle's, a family of 6 like our own. And after we carried their furniture and things upstairs, my brother suggested we do the same in our own house.
Laten we dat bij ons thuis gaan doen.
Leaving his mother and sisters behind, Stoffel, his brother Pete, and their father return to the family home in an attempt to salvage their possessions. Once there, they realize they are trapped.
En het water steeg alsmaar.
And the water kept on rising. It rose to such a high level as to make going back to the other house, where my mother and sisters were, quite impossible. So we stayed there until the house was swallowed up from under our feet by the water.
Onder onze voeten door het water verzwolgen werd.
As Stoffel, Piet, and their father make it to the roof just in time, elsewhere in Capella, Nelleke van Dienst and her family face their own struggle against the torrential waters.
Mijn vader en mijn broer die gingen naar buiten om te kijken.
My father and brother went outside to see what was going on, where they were met by a wall of water.
Toen hebben we nog
We then grabbed whatever we could manage and fled to the attic.
The water rises in the blink of an eye, making even the attic unsafe.
Op een gegeven moment ging de voorgevel eruit. En
We then went onto the roof of the kitchen.
toen moesten we er toch af.
It toppled when I, the last one, got on.
De keuken zijn we gegaan. En ik
Then all of us fell into the water.
kantelde.
And I remember thinking when I went under for a second time, if I go under a third time,
Toen weet ik nog,
I'll never surface again.
dat ik dacht van, nou, als ik de derde keer onderga, dan kom ik niet meer boven.
Clinging to a chunk of roof, Nelleke and her family float at the mercy of the floodwater's currents.
Op het dak.
We drifted across the street where two neighbors stood on the roof, ready for us. They got us off that raft.
Rondom gingen de huizen.
All around us, houses disappeared, collapsed. On top of that house, with the water reaching the roof, you are thinking, pretty soon it'll be our turn.
20 kilometers north, in Nieuwe Tonga, water surrounds Jacob Hoenendijk and his girlfriend's family.
Somebody hollered in the streets, run for your lives. The water's coming, the dikes are breaking. We run outside towards the inland dike. We were up to a chest high in the water. We fled to a house on top of the dike in this great big wave. It's just blew holes in the dike. And then the waves are banging against this wall on the bottom of the dike. And the whole thing was just going up and down.
Momentarily safe in an attic on top of the dike, Jacob watches helplessly as the flood consumes everything in its path.
It was just hanging on for dear life on eave troughs and sitting on top of roofs and waiting to be rescued. And then they just went like that. They just fell into the water and drowned. And you can hear them screaming.
On top of their home, rising waters give little room for retreat for Stoffel van Maurik and his brother and father.
Zagen we dat om ons heen op Capelle.
All around us at Capella,
Die gingen één
all those houses one by one,
in het water verdwijnen.
you saw them disappear in the
Soms
water.
met mensen. Soms
You didn't see a soul, but you knew the people who lived there. You knew they were inside,
Die daar woonden.
that they drowned
En
then.
het huis waar ze in zaten, dat ze verdronken.
Suddenly, their own house collapses beneath them, sending all three into the freezing waters.
En toen zeiden we, moeten gaan drijven. Oh,
Then we began to drift,
wat we konden krijgen.
and the trick was to grab something you could float
We
on.
zijn niet met z'n vieren gaan drijven.
All of us did not float together.
Maar wel.
That was not possible, but every man for
Het was
himself.
zelfs zo koud. Dat
It was so cold that I am still convinced
dat zo'n
that
kou,
very few people can survive a cold of that magnitude.
die is slechts door enkele personen is die te overleven.
I just let myself go because there was nothing else one could do.
Ja, want
I was constantly scared because it was the worst thing I'd ever experienced.
Dat was het allerlaatste.
That was the last thing,
Het enige
the only thing in my mind.
van
You're waiting for the end.
einde.
The Netherlands, Monday, February 1st, 1953. A severe storm over the North Sea has produced a surge of water that overruns the country's system of dikes, flooding numerous communities. After the storm passes, thousands of square kilometers of land remain covered by water. For those who lived through the initial flood, survival still hangs in the balance. Trapped in his grandparents' attic, Wim Kuiper and his family can only wait as the flood runs its course.
There sat my grandfather and my father on the stairs, and my mother's father. They were also with us. My father opened the door. The water flowed out the door. the tension broke.
Dus toen was de spanning over.
As the water recedes from the Kuipers village, more good news arrives when a rescue ship enters the nearby harbor.
On Monday, at about 3 o'clock, the Supra Ooster came sailing into the polder. That was the very first contact, and they took the first load of people, babies, older people and such.
Floating many kilometers from home, Stoffel van Maurik clings to wreckage as he bobs in the icy water. Completely alone, after being separated from his father and brother, he can only wonder at the fate of the rest of his family.
I was mired in an expanse of driftwood and debris accumulated there. But behind the field, I could see a dike. There was a dike. I searched left and right for boards or stuff that would float, that could serve as a sort of path, a bridge I could fashion to crawl over to the dike.
Stoffel manages to make his way through the water and debris and pull himself to safety on top of the dike.
I was unable to walk. The extreme cold had made my feet totally numb. I crawled onto that dike because people were working there. And one of these noticed me. They took me to the hospital in Goes.
In Capella, stranded atop a neighbor's house, Nelleke van Dienst and her family are finally rescued by another neighbor.
We were taken to a church. They had the heaters on. I remember that so well. And we sat around those heaters. It was so nice and warm.
North of Capella, the water recedes enough so that Jacob Hunendijk and his girlfriend and her family move from the home on top of the dike on which they've spent the night to higher ground at a nearby hotel.
There was no food, there was nothing to drink, and we were cold because it was below freezing.
5 days pass before rescuers reach Jacob and the rest of the group and take them to safety in a nearby town. By late afternoon Monday, February 1st, most survivors are reached. The first wave of rescuers comes from the flood-ravaged areas themselves.
And beginning Tuesday, helicopters arrived from the American Army and so on, and from Germany.
Within a matter of days, help comes from neighboring countries and from as far away as the United States. While rescue operations continue, the human tragedy becomes clear to the many who have lost loved ones.
In that hospital, I was told that my father, he had also arrived safely. Instinctively, we felt that those who had not been seen anywhere, that they were gone. But for my brother, who was an excellent swimmer, I had, well, high hope that he would make it. But he didn't make it.
Erg veel hoop op gehad dat hij het wel zou halen, maar hij heeft het niet gehaald. Dat huis waar mijn moeder...
The house where my mother and sisters were had also collapsed.
En daar heeft zelfs...
No one from that house had survived.
Heeft het overleefd. Ze zaten met...
There were 9 people in the house.
Zaten ze met 9 personen in dat huis.
And all 9 of them perished.
Die zijn omgekomen.
Nelleke van Dienst loses her grandparents, Kees and Keitja Koopman.
Mijn opa en mijn oma zijn dan verdronken.
My opa and oma, they drowned. They sat on a roof, and the neighbors saw my oma floating by. The following morning, she washed up at Rauwepolder, but my opa, he was never found.
The Netherlands suffers a terrible toll in the aftermath of the North Sea flood. 1,836 people perish, while more than 70,000 become homeless. The agriculture industry also suffers a crushing blow. 300 farms are wiped out, and more than 3,000 are heavily damaged.
Well, salt water kills everything. When the mess began to dry up, not a blade of grass, not a tree could be found. It was dead.
The total costs of the damage are estimated at a whopping $300 million US. A formal investigation into the causes of the flooding finds that the dike system protecting the Netherlands is in need of a major overhaul. The Dutch government immediately launches the Delta Plan, a sophisticated storm surge barrier comprised of sea arms and dikes designed to better protect the Dutch coast from future flooding.
It took no time at all for the government to promise real efforts to close the sea breaches.
Around the country, land is redistributed and a massive rebuilding operation takes place to restore communities. But while farms and cities are rebuilt, healing the lives of survivors proves much more difficult.
There was no work, except for those involved with the restoration. But it took, well, I think 3 years before the bulk of the people who wanted to come back had come back.
Dat is toch vrij snel bijgekomen dat ik mijn handen en mijn vingers weer kon gebruiken.
Fairly quickly, I was able to use my hands and fingers
Dat heeft
again,
heel lang geduurd. Dat heeft eigenlijk
but not my feet.
voordat mijn voeten.
It has taken years to regain full function of my
Het was
feet.
zelfs voor mij heel moeilijk.
Today, agriculture remains the backbone of Dutch culture, despite the country's modern bustle and industry. The North Sea flood of 1953 is commemorated in the Netherlands by a museum and local memorials in several communities.
Dat we nu blij zijn dat er voor de slachtoffers.
It makes us happy that there is now a memorial for the victims at Capella.
Maar wat we nu fijn vinden, dat is.
The thing that pleases us most is the fact that after 51 years,
Mensen die omgekomen zijn.
for all the people who perished, that to commemorate February 1st, we now have a monument in Capella in their memory.
Een gedenkmonument op Capelle.
And that makes us feel so very, very good.
Geweldig goed.
Only 400 kilometers away, and less than a year later, nature will again strike with deadly force. High in the Austrian Alps, another devastated community will struggle to recover from disaster. Blans, Austria is a small village in the Alps, nestled in a valley below the towering peaks of the Mount Kalf and the Falf Mountains.
In the 50s, you would just have found a few houses and a church. I think about 350 people lived there at that time, but only a few of them lived at the center, and all the others lived at separated farms all over the hills.
In the winter, the area around Blans creates conditions that are ideal for the formation of avalanches.
De geologie is nog insofern van bedeutung, weil
the geology contributes to the sliding of the avalanches. There is really no range of rough surfaces for the snow to hold on to bind onto.
Langsam talwärts gleitet über den Winter. Also das sind nicht die Lawinen.
With speeds approaching 450 kilometers per hour and pushing a wave of compressed air, an avalanche can pulverize virtually anything in its path. For more than 600 years, the villagers in Blans have been living with the awesome beauty of the Alps and the inevitable danger of avalanches. In 1954, 19-year-old Siegfried Jenny works on a farm outside Blans with his parents Alphonse and Susanna. Although the rest of his siblings have left home, his older brother Alois remains on the farm.
Ich bin eigentlich in einer behüteten Familie aufgewachsen.
I grew up in a happy family. I guess I was a latecomer. My siblings were all much older. We ran a small farm with some large and small animals.
Elsewhere in the village of Blans lives 21-year-old Anton Turcher. He farms along with his father, Leo. His mother, Antonia, cares for 8-year-old Josef and 5-year-old Maria Katerina, a spirited, happy child.
Sehr gut. 1954.
In 1954, 40% of the inhabitants lived off of agriculture.
Ausschließlich von der Landwirtschaft gelebt.
Living near the center of Blans is the village school teacher and principal, Eugen Dobla. He lives with his wife Lydia and their 4 children.
The fall was wonderful. There was no precipitation at all until Christmas Eve.
Eugen's 79-year-old mother also lives in Blans. She is known in the village simply as Mother Dobla. After a mild fall, January 9th, 1954, brings the heaviest snow of the season.
And with time, the snow became higher and higher. And with the snow grew the worry about avalanches.
There were avalanche warnings all over the country because everyone knew it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Sunday morning, January 10th, 9 a.m. Warnings prove to be correct as a small avalanche rushes down a nearby valley.
The heaps of snow became bigger and bigger. On the street, there was barely any traffic. The walkways were practically deserted. Everybody stayed in their houses.
Monday morning, January 11th. Dawn finds Siegfried Jenny at breakfast with his parents and brother.
Haben wir im Wohnzimmer das Frühstück eingenommen.
We ate our breakfast in the dining room. Very little was said while we were eating, and we felt uncomfortable because we knew that the situation was very dangerous.
Weil man wusste, dass es sehr gefährlich ist.
Despite the risk, Siegfried and his father go to the barn to tend to their animals. A few moments later, they are joined by Alois, Siegfried's brother.
Plötzlich beginnt ein gewaltiges Tosen.
Suddenly, there was a powerful roaring, and the building started to come apart. The barn window was immediately smashed from the avalanche. My father yelled, "Allo!" which meant an avalanche, and it was immediately dark in the barn.
Und gleich wird es dunkel im Stall. Ich drehe mich zur Talseite.
I turned right around and held my hands over my head.
Und
and there was even enough time to say a prayer. Suddenly, it simply took me with it. And then I hit my head against the hard snow. My hands had already been torn away. And I thought that I would soon suffocate in this condition.
Jetzt werde ich gleich einmal ersticken.
At the Turcher farm, Anton comes in from working with his father to make coffee. Antonia and the 2 younger children are still asleep upstairs when Anton returns to the house.
Ich bin in die Küche und
I was in the kitchen. As I was bent over the stove, the bang occurred, and the rumbling came over me. I was pressed against the stove, still kneeling, and I had on top of my back boards that fell from the roof, and I was close to suffocating from the dust created by the broken walls, and the snow and the pressure created by the avalanche.
Zusammengebrochenen Mauern und dem ungeheuren Luftdruck, den die Lawine verursacht hat.
The powerful avalanche sweeps Anton and part of the house away before finally coming to rest further downhill.
Ich dachte natürlich, dass ich jetzt sterben muss, habe aber dann
I thought that of course I was going to die,
bekommen,
but then I got some air.
Stockfinster.
At first, everything was completely black,
Ich habe kaum
and I could not free my arms.
freimachen können. Die Sorge die
My worry for my family
dazu
pushed me to the ends of my strength.
meine Kraft
and I began to dig with my hands in the hard snow. And then later, with a little piece of wood. Then I could climb onto the stove. And from there, I could see the first little bit of light. Then I climbed on top with my feet and my elbows, like a mountain climber or a caver. And then I could force my way out of the opening.
Wie ein Kaminkehrer oder ein Kletterer und konnte mich dann aus der Öffnung zwingen.
When Anton pulls himself from beneath the snow, he finds his familiar world transformed by the terrible force of the avalanche. The same avalanche miraculously releases Siegfried Jenny. Luckily, he remains above the surface of the snow, unlike many less fortunate who have been buried by the avalanche.
Anschließend stehe ich auf,
I stood up and looked at myself, to see whether everything still functioned, and if I was in one piece. My clothes were in shreds, and I had a bruise on the back of my left hand, which was bleeding. There was chaos everywhere, and the hayloft was lying below me in the direction of the valley. When I looked for the house, I saw only a box with 4 corners. The roof was gone. My mother was standing in the window and calling out, "Where are the other 2?" I called out very loudly for my father and my brother, but there was no reply.
A neighbor arrives at the Jenny farm and sends Siegfried into the village to seek medical attention for himself and his mother. Neither are fit to help search for survivors. They eventually find shelter at Mother Dobla's house.
In afternoon, more and more people came in, those who were injured. And in the end, there was a total of 14 people in this house.
Meanwhile, Anton Turcher searches frantically for his family.
Dann habe ich natürlich geschrien.
After I screamed, I heard an answer from my father, coming from what was left of the barn. And then the neighbors yelled to us that my mother and my brother were still alive and were in a pile of hay in their barn. I began to look for my sister.
Nach meiner Schwester gesucht.
The villagers of Blans who managed to dig themselves out of the avalanche or escape its devastating power now face the daunting prospect of searching for survivors buried in the snow.
They had no machines and nothing. They just, I think they had their shovels and their hands.
As precious hours pass, another threat becomes clear. A second avalanche threatens to fall from the peak of the Mont Calf. Rescue efforts are halted in the late afternoon when failing light and the fear of another avalanche force rescuers back to the central portion of the village. Certain that another avalanche is imminent, Eugen Dobla decides to move his family to a safer location in the village. On his way, he stops at the Adla, an inn owned by his brother. He finds several villagers there and tells his brother that they need to find a safer place. Tucked away at Mother Dobla's house, Siegfried Jenny waits to hear about his missing family members.
Selbstverständlich hat man immer
I naturally was always thinking about what had happened to my father and brother. Again and again I experienced that some people had been found buried alive while others had been found dead. We lived between hope and fear about what had happened. Everyone was afraid.
January 11th, 1954. In Blans, Austria, a massive avalanche falls from the peak of the Falf mountain, ripping a swath of destruction through the village. Rescuers from Blans search for survivors throughout the day, but call off their effort as daylight fails. As fears of another avalanche force villagers to find a safe place for the night, the Mont Calf can no longer contain the snow on its peaks. A second avalanche tumbles toward the beleaguered village. At Mother Dobla's house, unsuspecting survivors of the first avalanche make the best of their situation.
Und es wird gebetet, und zwar 3 Rosenkränze hintereinander.
We prayed 3 rosaries, one after the other. As we were saying the 3rd rosary, there was suddenly very great pressure on the house. Children and adults were screaming and everything became loud. The room fell apart like a house of cards, and then it took me with it.
Und da ging es mit mir fort.
Once again, Siegfried Jenny is swept away by the uncompromising force of an avalanche. This time, he is buried below a mountain of snow and debris.
Bleibe dann inmitten von Holztrümmern stecken.
I remained in the middle of the wooden rubble.
Immer wieder sehr stark Hilfe gerufen, wenn ich habe.
I was crying very loudly for help. But after I cried for help 3 or 4 times, there was no oxygen left. And I had to wait for a while until I had enough oxygen again.
Eben Sauerstoff hatte.
Elsewhere in the village, word reaches Eugen Dobla that another avalanche has fallen, this time taking his mother's house with it. Eugen, his wife Lydia, and several others hurry to the site of the latest tragedy.
Ungefähr nach 20.
About 20 minutes after the avalanche stopped, 6 men and a woman came from the village. I called for help again, very loudly. And then someone said, "Stop! Someone is here." They located me and immediately began to remove the snow with picks and shovels.
Haben gleich angefangen mit Pickel und Schaufel den Schnee zu entfernen.
Siegfried is brought out of the snow for a second time and taken back to a safe house in the village.
Daneben auf der Ofenbank lag da.
It was then that I thought, where is my mother now?
Wo ist jetzt meine Mutter? Sie wurde eigentlich schon vor mir aus der Lawine befreit.
She was actually dug out of the avalanche before me. When a 16-year-old girl saw a slipper in the snow somewhere, and underneath it lay my mother. She had almost suffocated because she had snow in her mouth.
Bereits nahe, weil sie noch Schnee im Mund hatte.
As exhausted village rescuers continue to search for survivors of the 2 avalanches, the enormity of their task becomes clear. They desperately need outside help. By morning, the snow finally stops. With roads blocked and telephone lines down, the only choice the villagers of Blans have is to send for help on foot.
We sent out 3 boys that were told to walk to the head office to report the disaster to the regional head officer.
The response to the plea for help arrives on Tuesday, January 12th.
There were, I think, hundreds of people who went in with skis because there was no other way to get into this valley. You had to go on skis. And they went in even as it was still dangerous to go there. But they said, we have to help, we have to go there. And they went in to bring help and to help the people there to find maybe if there are still survivors.
Finally, on Wednesday, January 13th, a full-scale rescue operation arrives from Switzerland and the American military stationed in Austria. Helicopters ferry the injured to hospital.
Und dann gab es auch sehr viele Helfer, also vom Tal.
A great number of rescue workers came from outside the valley. The Swiss rescue aircraft team was there with the helicopter.
Ein Hubschrauber da.
Und dann
I discussed a rescue operation plan with the police in Blans.
mit der Gendarmerie einen Einsatzplan besprochen.
I knew the other villagers quite well, so I was able to tell them to look for 2 men in this house, 3 men in that house.
Je nachdem, es wurde praktisch an allen Stellen gegraben.
Eugen Dobla's mother is recovered from beneath the snow and debris of her house.
We lost three, all three houses. But luckily, our lives were spared. And that's what really counts. You can replace all things, but not human lives.
Siegfried Jenny and his mother survived both avalanches. Siegfried's father and brother Alois are found dead in the barn where the first avalanche struck. The Turcher family is touched by tragedy as well.
Sadly, and this was the hardest loss, was the loss of my 5-year-old sister, who was moved from her bed and underneath the house was killed by a rafter from the roof. She died on the spot. She did not have to suffer.
Blans suffers one of the worst avalanche tragedies in the history of the Alps. 57 people die, and many others are injured. Practically everyone in Blans is touched in some way by the disaster. 29 houses and 50 stables are completely destroyed. 91 men, women, and children are left homeless. 2 weeks after the avalanches strike Blans, the Austrian government appoints a rehabilitation committee to coordinate reconstruction of the village. Government and private contributions total millions of dollars.
Property-wise, everything was destroyed. Our house, the barn. Without help from the government, we could not have built ourselves another house and would have been forced to move out of the village.
Along with the reconstruction in Blans, new avalanche measures are built high above the village.
The security measures, which had been done in the following years, made it a very secure region until today. They rebuilt the forest, they made a lot of snow bridges and other measures of technical measures for billions of dollars.
Today, the village of Blans has a population of about 350 people. It continues to depend primarily on agriculture, while striving to make inroads in the tourist industry. In 2004, on the 50th anniversary of the disaster, the 1954 avalanches are commemorated in Blans with presentations, displays, and photography exhibits. However, the effects of the natural disasters faced in both Austria and the Netherlands can never be completely forgotten.
Die Gefahr macht die Menschen härter. Auf jeden Fall.
Danger makes people tougher, definitely. Some people have to struggle against water, others have to struggle against wind, and we had to fight an avalanche in snow. Somehow it gives people energy. It is dangerous, but I stayed.
My mother did not really ever forget the death of my sister, and she carried this sorrow her whole life.
Dieses Leid ein Leben lang mit sich.
Mijn vader die heeft er toch wel zeker.
My father, during that first period, which lasted some years, he remained in a depressive state because he found it difficult, if not impossible, to pick himself up again. He was the one who had lost his wife and 3 children, and so it was difficult for my father. Pretty well impossible, it seemed, to start over again.
Zodoende was het voor mijn vader moeilijk. Soms was het vrijwel onmogelijk om de draad op te pakken.
Het is wel een verschil met mensen die het niet meegemaakt hebben en mensen die ook niet van hier komen.
There definitely is a difference between the people who lived through it, those who came from elsewhere.
En dat zullen ze ook nooit terugdenken.
They don't have the awareness of it all, and they'll never comprehend how it was. Because one has to have experienced it in order to perceive it.
Er een gevoel biedt aan, laat ik het zo zeggen.